Calvin drove to pick me up, a man who had always been cold and abstinent. Yet, he let his new secretary sit in the passenger seat. I knew then, this marriage couldn't be saved. Chapter 1. That day, Calvin drove to pick me up. When I opened the passenger door, I froze for a moment. A young and beautiful girl was sitting in the passenger seat, smiling sweetly at me. "Hello, sister-in-law." The girl greeted me politely, but she didn't show any intention of getting up to give me the seat. I squinted slightly, turning my gaze to Calvin. Calvin was looking down, answering a call, unaware of the undercurrents brewing here. Today, we were supposed to go to an auction together. I had been looking forward to this date with him, dressing up carefully, only to find someone else in his passenger seat. "Hello, sister-in-law. My name is Nicole. I'm Mr. Hahn's new assistant." The girl smiled warmly, her dimples sweet and shallow. "I heard you're going to a private auction tonight, so I asked Mr. Hahn to let me tag along to see the world." "Don't worry, I won't disturb you." My heart sank instantly to the bottom. I knew this cold and perfect man too well. He had always been distant. He wouldn't easily let others into his space. We were brought together by an arranged marriage. After careful consideration, we chose each other. Outsiders joked that I would be living like a widow, but after confirming our relationship, Calvin would hold me with gentle eyes. When emotions stir, his eyes would even redden slightly. He said, "You are my wife. We are one body. You are different from others." But today, something seemed to have changed. Chapter 2. But I am not a weak, submissive woman. I am Mary, who never swallows her anger and always acts on her own terms. "Get out!" I coldly ordered her, showing no mercy. The girl was stunned for a moment. She didn't expect that on our first meeting, I would openly disregard her dignity. Perhaps my tone was too harsh. Nicole was momentarily at a loss. Sorry, sister-in-law." Her voice quivered with tears, and she sulkily moved to the back seat. Calvin had just finished his call and looked over at us. He realized I was upset. A hint of helplessness and indulgence crossed his face. He leaned over and fastened my seatbelt for me. Noticing that the seat position had been adjusted, I impatiently readjusted it. All the fuss made my temper flare. "It's so annoying. Why would anyone dare adjust my passenger seat?" The tension in the car was palpable, and the girl was too scared to speak. Calvin frowned slightly, and calmly suggested to me, "If you're not in a good mood today, we can just go home." The woman in the rearview mirror was silently shedding tears. I was extremely annoyed. "Nicole, right? I'm not in the mood to go now. You can take a cab home. Mr. Hahn and I are heading back." The girl's face turned pale, and she weakly looked at Calvin, but he didn't intervene to help her. Nicole got out of the car, devastated. Chapter 3. Calvin would never embarrass me in front of others. He always knew how to restrain his emotions, so he suggested we go home. If there's something wrong, we deal with it at home. This was the unspoken rule between us for years. She's just a fresh college graduate. Why bother with her? Calvin pulled me into his arms. For the first time, Calvin didn't understand. What? In all these years, this is the first time you've let another woman sit in your passenger seat. The man didn't expect that this was what I cared about. Everyone in our circle knows how outstanding Calvin is. There are countless women who fancy him, but he has always kept himself pure. He is surrounded by many, yet remains untouched. Calvin smiled faintly, ruffling my hair. "Who would have thought I could actually make you jealous?" He leaned down and kissed me, his nose brushing against my cheek. "She is my subordinate. Nothing more. There will never be anything else between us." Calvin cupped my face, staring into my eyes. He gave me his solemn promise. Chapter 4. A woman's intuition is always accurate. Even though I had only met Nicole once, my intuition told me that this girl definitely had other intentions towards Calvin. I thought that giving her a stern warning on our first meeting would be enough, but I never expected that the necklace, which was supposed to be mine from the auction, would be hanging around her neck the next day. Eva, Calvin's chief assistant, sent me a photo and a screenshot from social media. In the photo, the crescent diamond necklace was hanging on Nicole's fair neck, making her look even more delicate and charming. Her eyes were red and swollen, but a smile lingered at the corners of her mouth. It seemed she had cried herself to sleep the night before and received someone's gift in return. In the screenshot Nicole had posted on social media, the chairman said that a girl must stay strong even when she's wronged. Wipe away the tears. I will be obedient. My dear chairman. A few cute fist-pumping emojis, and a picture of the necklace in its box. At that moment, my blood nearly froze. Though it was hard to admit, I had to acknowledge it. I was so provoked that I nearly lost my composure. The feeling was unbearable, like seeing a beloved white handkerchief stained with mosquito blood. The sensation was bizarre for me. I even considered, regardless of the facts, jumping into my yellow Ferrari and slapping that woman right in the face. But then I looked at my hands and realized that putting a cheap pretentious coquette in my sights was beneath me. I called Laura from Hermes. Laura's voice was filled with barely suppressed excitement. Over the phone, she assured me, "Don't worry, Mrs. Han. Even if we have to empty all of Shanghai, I'll make sure you get everything you want." So that day, before the end of the workday, except for Nicole, all 46 assistants and office girls at Han Group's headquarters received a lavish gift from the chairman's wife, a Hermes necklace worth 120,000 yuan. Although each piece wasn't as valuable as the 2 million yuan auction necklace, there were many, and the gesture was fair. Eva handled the situation smoothly. She required that everyone post on social media with a caption. The chairman's wife said every girl deserves the best. Clench your fists. I will be obedient. My dear chairman's wife. The recipients were naturally happy to comply. As assistants and office staff, they were the gossip center of the entire company. Now that they had received gifts from the chairman's wife, who wouldn't be thrilled to post pictures and captions? Some clever ones even added a line to their posts. The chairman's wife really knows how to play the game. The influence of these assistants might not be significant within the company, but their ability to spread information across departments was formidable. In less than half an hour, the entire company knew that the chairman's wife had gifted everyone Hermes necklaces. As for the reason, the various gossip groups had already started buzzing. Nicole's face turned pale, as if she had been deeply humiliated. Her eyes reddened as she fled to the restroom to take off the diamond necklace. Two colleagues who were there touching up their makeup glanced at her and chuckled ambiguously. Nicole was mortified. She lowered her head and hurried out of the restroom, with the mocking laughter growing more brazen behind her. Her cheeks flushed. She placed the necklace back in its box, and returned it to Calvin, just as it had been. Chapter 5. Calvin had just finished a video call with his business partner. He saw the girl, who had clearly been crying again, holding the necklace box, looking forlornly at her feet. "What's wrong?" Calvin asked, puzzled. Nicole's tears started flowing even before she could speak. She choked out in a soft, pitiful voice, "Mr. Han, please take this necklace back. I'm too afraid to keep it." A faint displeasure flickered across Calvin's stern face. His instincts told him that something must have happened, but he didn't question her directly. He just quietly observed the person in front of him. Nicole bit her lip, hesitated for a long time, and finally took the initiative to recount everything that had happened in the office today. "Mr. Han, I'm sorry for always causing you trouble. I just posted on social media to encourage myself. I didn't know how Mrs. Han found out." Nicole sobbed softly. "I didn't expect her to be so angry." The woman looked as pitiful as a helpless little rabbit. "Mr. Han, I want to apologize to her. I can explain everything to her in person." Calvin never had the habit of checking social media. His time was consumed by work, but as the chairman of the group, he was well aware of the tendency for rumors to spread within the company, and his usually stern face grew even colder. "I understand," he said in a deep voice. Chapter 6. That evening, Calvin brought Nicole home. The girl, timid and nervous, stood behind the man. "I brought Nicole here so she could clear things up in person." Calvin sighed. "Mary, Nicole is just my secretary. Because of what happened yesterday, I casually gave her a gift as an apology. Nothing more." I stirred my silver spoon, finishing the bird's nest soup Auntie had made. "I'm sorry, sister-in-law." Nicole bowed to me with a sincere attitude. She was trembling, soft and weak. "This is the first time I've received such an expensive gift. and I got a bit carried away with excitement. If I did something that upset you, you can tell me, and I'll correct it immediately. I raised an eyebrow. Nicole, right? The girl glanced at Calvin, seemingly trying to draw courage from him, and slowly nodded, seeing her bravely, yet naively, try to challenge me. I couldn't help but find it amusing. I'm not your teacher, nor your boss, so I don't have time to teach you how to behave, but I am Calvin's wife, so if anyone dares to get too close to my husband, I won't give her a chance to make things right. The girl had probably never encountered someone as straightforward as me, and her increasingly embarrassed face only showed how fragile she really was. Mary, Nicole is here to apologize to you. Calvin understood my temperament and methods. Even if he didn't approve of what I did today, he could understand how I felt. So he didn't argue with me. He simply agreed to let Nicole apologize to me. He had already made concessions, hoping I would let go of the misunderstanding. We're all smart people. Even a single glance can convey what we mean to each other. I understand. I decided to give Calvin a chance. After all, he hadn't actually cheated. But there won't be a next time, no matter who it is. Chapter 7. You didn't need to resort to such tactics against a girl. Calvin brought up the topic before bed. You should have told me first. I was sitting at the dressing table, brushing my hair, staring at the handsome man in the mirror. You knew I liked that necklace, yet you gave it to another woman. Isn't it natural for me to be angry? I couldn't bear the thought of what it would be like if this perfect man were tainted. Whether I could still love him as much. Calvin remained calm, moving to the bar to pour himself a glass of ice water. She cried the whole night because of your misunderstanding. In the morning, when I saw her eyes so swollen, I gave her the necklace as an apology. Not a single flaw in his reasoning. I scrutinized him coldly for a long time. 2 million might be a small amount for us, so casually giving it away is understandable. It's just a matter of whether the recipient is worth it. The man's fingertips tapped on the marble countertop. He was waiting for me to think it over. This was the first time a third party had caused a rift between us in our relationship. The upbringing and values we both had made us feel weary of such matters. We were both people who valued decorum. Calvin, I love you. Calvin paused, his fingers frozen in place. He probably hadn't expected me to say that suddenly. Calvin, I love that pure and untainted version of you. That's what sets you apart from others. You never used to let women get close because you had an aversion to anything impure. You wanted a clean marriage. I wasn't that kind of person before, but your values influenced me. Now, we share the same life goals. I hope our marriage never takes a wrong turn. Calvin sighed. I haven't. Chapter 8. Calvin is a very clear-headed person. He knew I minded, so he wouldn't give Nicole any more chances to harbor illusions. Without the chairman's support, Nicole, as an intern, could only start with the most basic tasks. Before, she had opportunities to take shifts at the front desk. Now, Eva didn't even schedule her for that. I didn't hint at anyone to exclude her, since Calvin knew where to draw the line. I fully trusted him, but in such matters, I didn't need to give any instructions. Many people are eager to kick someone when they're down. In less than half a month, this new secretary couldn't bear the work disparity and psychological blows and lost a significant amount of weight. The turning point came after an important high-level meeting. That day, Nicole was assigned to clean up a small conference room alone. The girl, dressed in a business suit, was kneeling on the ground, struggling to scrape gum off the carpet with a blade. This scene was witnessed by Calvin, who had returned unexpectedly. Sensing someone behind her, Nicole scrambled to her feet in a panic. Calvin's gaze was deep and cold. This silent scrutiny shattered Nicole's self-esteem. Mr. Hahn. Tears began to fall uncontrollably from the girl's eyes. She wasn't acting. She wasn't pretending. Calvin had always been the son she admired but could never touch. As she was pushed to the margins, she was almost ready to give up. But now, seeing herself in this state, exposed in front of the man she admired, Nicole wanted nothing more than to push Calvin away and flee. In just half a month, the once lively and cheerful girl had become so fragile. This was the first time Calvin lost his temper. When he got home, he angrily smashed the glass of water I handed him onto the floor. The water splashed everywhere, Why won't you leave her alone? Mary, I respect and love you, and I've tolerated your insults and harm towards her time and time again. What satisfaction do you get from bullying someone weaker? I recalled that during Calvin's time studying abroad, his younger sister in middle school had committed suicide by jumping off a building due to school bullying. It had left an indelible scar on his heart, making him utterly loathe such actions. Mary, don't let me see you use these methods to hurt others again, or I won't stand by idly. I stared blankly at the man in front of me, who was losing control. For the first time since our marriage, Calvin lost his composure and lashed out at me for another woman, for something I hadn't done. The feeling was unbearable. It was like glass shattering, like spilled water that couldn't be gathered back. Chapter 9. Calvin promoted Nicole to be his personal assistant. At the same time, he decisively fired Eva, the executive assistant who had worked alongside him for 7 years. You need to understand who you're really working for. Eva had always been stubborn in some areas. I'm working for you, Mr. Hahn. There are some matters that I handle privately with Mrs. Hahn, but only in regard to personal affairs. Calvin threw the work schedule in front of Eva. Is that so? So righteous? Did your professional ethics also lead you to bully others? Eva was speechless. She knew she had been caught making things difficult for Nicole, and her face showed her guilt. Calvin saw right through it. With no tolerance, unable to distinguish right from wrong, and using your position to oppress colleagues. What qualifies you to continue as my executive assistant? Eva left the office in defeat. Several assistants outside looked on with concern. Eva, are you really leaving? Tears welled up in Eva's eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. Yes, I'm leaving. Farewell. Sisters. Chapter 10. Calvin and I fell into an unprecedented Cold War. He stayed at a hotel. Nicole came to pick up his clothes. When Calvin wants to make someone suffer, he's even more ruthless than I am. The housekeeper had already received a call. She had neatly packed Calvin's essentials. Nicole, likely still intimidated by my temper, took the suitcase from the housekeeper and obediently took a cab. Before leaving, she cautiously said, "Ma'am, Mr. Hahn asked me to add you as a friend. In the future, if you need anything, you can contact me." With Eva gone, Nicole had taken over her duties. There's nothing to discuss. Tell him to get as far away as possible. Nicole didn't understand why I could still be so defiant. Even though Calvin was now living in a hotel, her eyes showed confusion. But more than that, a sense of triumph. The housekeeper shook her head and kindly advised, "Ma'am, why don't you just give in a little? Go and apologize to the master. The two of you never used to fight, so why have things suddenly escalated like this?" The housekeeper had been with the Hahn family for over a decade. After all this time, there were feelings involved. He's waiting for me to apologize, isn't he? Ridiculous. Why should I apologize? Chapter 11. Calvin never returned home, but Nicole's social media was updated frequently. Most of the posts were about Calvin's itinerary, a custom evening gown for some socialite grandmother, an invitation to a private equity gala, the fireworks at a summit forum, the night breeze at the Burj Al Arab, photos with the CEO of Capital, and more. Each one seemed to express how meeting the right person had opened up many new experiences in her life. The posts were getting hundreds of likes. Some people even suggested in the comments that she should start a vlog to showcase the daily life of the upper class. Several mutual friends, puzzled, sent me screenshots of her social media posts with question marks. These days, if you want to know Mr. Hahn's whereabouts, just follow his secretary's social media and you'll get a pretty good idea. Everyone was smart enough to keep their words subtle. In the past, I was the one who usually accompanied Calvin to events. If I was busy or didn't want to go, one of his assistants would take turns to accompany him. Now, his regular female companion had changed. I didn't have the energy to respond to my friend's well-meaning reminders. I just sent a simple thank you emoji. At that time, I was privately working with Bai's accounting firm to help me with asset division. It was a massive and complex task. Due to our marriage, the two conglomerates held shares in each other. There were also the family funds I managed, various properties, metals, stocks, yachts, and other investments too numerous to count. There were even some foreign properties that I had to look up the deeds and photos for to vaguely remember. Organizing all of this was time-consuming. Chapter 12. That day, I received a call from Calvin, who had just returned from a business trip. Mom wants us to come over for dinner. All right. We acted like nothing had happened. Just as usual, the driver picked up Calvin from the airport. Then he picked me up, and we headed to the Gu residence together. Calvin and Nicole sat in the back seat, and they actually left the front seat for me. Nicole's schadenfreude was evident. I found my situation amusing in its absurdity, but this time, I didn't assert my position. I calmly accepted the front seat. Calvin's expression was cold, and the tension around him was palpable. Sister-in-law, we just got back from Manhattan today. The old lady mentioned she wanted to see Mr. Han, so I picked up some gifts and thought I'd accompany him to visit her. Nicole was just as talkative as before, but her demeanor had matured and become more refined. It seemed that her time shadowing Calvin had taught her a lot. I didn't respond, closing my eyes to rest. Nicole, realizing she wasn't getting any attention, fell silent. Calvin remained tight-lipped, and the car was quiet for the rest of the ride. Chapter 13. When Han's mother saw Nicole, she was a bit surprised. Nicole smoothly greeted and introduced herself. She seemed to have mastered the art of flattery. In no time, she had Han's mother laughing heartily. At the dinner table, Nicole started sharing amusing stories about Calvin at work. Han's mother smiled approvingly. Then she asked about Calvin's personal life. Nicole seamlessly took over the conversation. The atmosphere at the table grew noticeably tense. Nicole, still smiling with her dimples showing, suddenly realized she had overstepped in the chilly atmosphere and wasn't completely foolish. Daily life matters were supposed to be my territory. Han's mother wasn't an idiot. Calvin remained silent. I elegantly dabbed my mouth with a napkin. Mom, I'm pregnant. Oh, really? Mary? This was fantastic news. Han's mother's eyes lit up. When did you find out? The man who had been silently brooding since getting into the car showed a rare hint of emotion on his face. I raised an eyebrow with malicious delight. I just found out yesterday. The doctor said it's been 3 weeks. Han's mother was overjoyed, eager to call Han's father and arrange to go to the hospital with me tomorrow. Nicole was taken aback, her big almond eyes looking so innocent and pure. Sister-in-law, are you sure about the timing? Mr. Han and I have been abroad on business for the past 2 months. Han's mother's face froze at these words. There's no mistake. I went to see Professor Fong, a renowned obstetrician, and she confirmed it's been 3 weeks. I emphasized the words 3 weeks. Calvin knew very well that he hadn't been home during that time. This child wasn't his. The warmth on the man's face instantly vanished. Mary. A storm was brewing around Calvin, but he was desperately trying to suppress it, seemingly waiting for an explanation from me. My smile grew more triumphant. Congratulations, Calvin. I'm going to be a mother. Don't joke about this. He spoke coldly. I placed the pregnancy report I had prepared in front of him. Unfortunately, this isn't a joke. While you were off on a honeymoon with your lover, I was feeling lonely and had some fun with a few old flames. Now I don't even know who the father is. If you don't mind, I could let the child call you Dad, but he'll have to take my last name. With every word I spoke, Calvin's expression grew colder. That's enough. When I uttered the last sentence, Calvin finally lost his composure. I paid no heed to his anger. Calvin, how does it feel to be cheated on? Chapter 14. Calvin never imagined that I would brazenly have an affair and then self-righteously announce to the world that I was pregnant with another man's child. I've never cheated on you. His hands clenched tightly, veins bulging. It seemed this news had truly shaken him. We were just working together. We never crossed the line. I have never been unfaithful. I touched my belly, no longer interested in his belated explanations. Your secretary flaunts your daily work life together on social media. Calvin, haven't you seen it? Even our friends noticed and warned me. Don't you think that counts as crossing the line? If you can take her out to gaze at the stars and the moon, then I can discuss poetry and philosophy with other men. Calvin, rarely this angry, was furious. I, on the other hand, didn't care. In fact, I felt a bit regretful. What a pity, Calvin. I didn't have time to bring a man home to Han Garden with me. Compared to your provocative behavior today, I'm still a bit behind. Calvin couldn't accept it. He believed he and Nicole were innocent. Aside from work communication, their interactions were minimal. He simply wanted to use Nicole to shake things up around him. He couldn't understand why things had spiraled out of control like this. Before this, he had always believed our marriage was stable and happy. Sister-in-law, Mr. Han and I are innocent. In front of Han's mother, Nicole was eager to defend herself. Mrs. Han and I have spoken a few times on the phone. For the sake of work, I took this opportunity to visit. This is all just work to me. You might not understand, since you've never had a job, but as the chairman's chief secretary, I have to be thorough in everything. But Mr. Han and I have never crossed the line. Nicole sat next to Calvin, her posture straight and confident. Is that so? On the way here, you sat next to Calvin while the chairman's wife sat in the front. Did your thoroughness suddenly go out the window? I mercilessly exposed her hypocrisy. Nicole was speechless, unsure how to respond, and I didn't let Calvin off the hook either. Calvin, is this the chief assistant you've been grooming for the past 2 months? Eva is also a woman. Also your secretary. She's been with you since she graduated from university. Has she ever sat next to you? She's even more thorough than Nicole. Have I ever targeted her once? Calvin's breathing grew rapid, a red flush creeping into the corners of his eyes. Let's get a divorce. Calvin. Chapter 15. The man dragged me back home, leaving Nicole behind at the Han estate. This was the first time he had returned home since our Cold War began. The house was already mostly cleared out by me. Even the housekeepers had been dismissed. Calvin stopped in his tracks, stunned, as the home we had shared for 3 years suddenly felt foreign. He finally realized my mention of divorce had been premeditated. Calvin's eyes reddened, disbelief filling them as he pulled me tightly into his arms. Mary, I didn't cheat. His voice, low and dejected, echoed in my ear. You can get rid of the baby, and we can start over. It was as if I had heard a joke. I retorted sarcastically. That's my child. Why should I get rid of it? My calmness seemed to pierce Calvin's heart. I didn't do anything wrong. You know that. I broke free from his grip. Yes, I know. You're still clean. But what's the point? You had Nicole come to our home to pick up your suitcase, knowing it would disgust me. You took her to every event, knowing I'd be criticized. You knew all of this, yet you still did it. You allowed her provocations, letting me be humiliated, forcing me to reconcile. You despise me for bullying the weak. But Calvin, did you see how that so-called weakling repeatedly provoked me? Tears streamed down my face as I recalled everything, unable to believe how fragile my marriage had become. You knew she had feelings for you, didn't you? I warned you a long time ago. Calvin, willful ignorance is more deadly than ignorance itself. Calvin's body trembled, his stance unsteady, his voice barely a whisper. I'm sorry, Mary. She reminded me of Sophie, and I was afraid you'd turn into one of those monsters. Sophie Han, who also had 2 sweet dimples. I just didn't want to see her cry. I never had any thoughts about her. Looking at the man's remorse, I felt nothing inside. Maybe he was innocent, but I wasn't about to foolishly hand over my vulnerabilities to someone who might hurt me. Chapter 16. Calvin refused to agree to a divorce. He hired a new, elite male executive assistant. He even got himself drunk in the wine cellar. It took all my strength to help him to the couch. He handled his alcohol well, quiet and compliant. But when I was about to leave, the man, with red eyes, pulled me into his arms, fragile and pleading. Mary, let's not get divorced, okay? If you want this child, then have him. As for Nicole, a large corporation has its own rules and procedures, and he couldn't fire someone without cause if they hadn't done anything wrong. But the chairman's deliberate distancing was undeniably sending a message. The former personal assistant of the chairman, seemingly overnight, had gone from the envy of all to the subject of private ridicule. When Nicole came to see me, her former youthful radiance was gone, and no amount of makeup could hide her exhaustion. I saw you on my first day at the company. Her opening statement caught me off guard. That day, I brought you tea and stood by your side, waiting for your instructions. You and Mr. Han were discussing what would be a suitable wedding gift for a friend, and you never once looked at me. Her face was full of mockery. For someone like Mr. Han, if it weren't for work, I'd never have had the chance to know him. And you? You just had the luck of being born into a good family, so you could marry him. At the auction, I told Mr. Han that it was impolite for the boss to sit in the front while the employee sat in the back. I said I'd switch back once I saw you. Mr. Han didn't object. The girl seemed to reminisce about the pride she felt that day. I ordered a coffee and dessert for her, just as I did for myself. My usual aloofness seemed to sting her, making her eyes red with anger, and her hatred grew more intense. Someone like you, a spoiled rich kid, what right do you have to look down on me? Nicole glared at me with contempt. You don't deserve Mr. Han's love. Is that so? Did you manage to get it? I leisurely watched as the person before me became flustered. Her childish face struggled to maintain a facade of calm. Isn't it because I threatened you? Otherwise, why would you be so upset and want a divorce? I slowly stirred my coffee. Because I cheated and got pregnant with another man's child. You know that already, don't you? You. Nicole was choking on her own words. Her emotions were on the brink of collapse. What's there to be so proud of? You're a bad-tempered, jobless, old woman who's pregnant with another man's bastard. Do you think Mr. Han will still want you? Slap. I didn't hesitate to give her a sharp slap across the face. First of all, no matter how old I am, I'm still 2 years younger than your precious Mr. Han. Second, who do you think you are, calling my child a bastard? And lastly, I've been wanting to slap you for a long time. You fool. Chapter 17. When I was 4 months pregnant, the Han family realized there was no turning back. Under pressure from Han Corporation, Calvin agreed to a peaceful divorce. The holdings between the two families were extensive, and the strategic cooperation that had been agreed upon was mutually beneficial, so our parents saw no need to alter it. The division of premarital assets was very clear. Neither side had any objections. The post-marriage joint finances were also meticulously organized by me. Calvin calmly signed the papers. He looked like a fallen crane from a once great pedestal, his wings broken by his own hand, with blood staining his once pure feathers. We divorced with dignity, and we said our goodbyes to each other. Chapter 18. When the baby was born, he took my last name. Outsiders thought he was premature, but he had excellent genes. My mother kept asking who the father was. I didn't tell her. The so-called one-night stand was just a lie I made up. But they didn't need to know that. Since he was a boy, my parents no longer pressured me to remarry. They decided to raise him as an heir while they were still young. As the little one grew, he began to resemble his father more and more, without the constraints of marriage. I've spent the last few years living freely and indulgently. I've had a few young and handsome boyfriends. Eva and I occasionally chat. From her, I've heard some gossip. Nicole didn't last 6 months at her job. She left on her own. But in this circle, everyone is well informed. No major company would hire her. Calvin has become increasingly isolated and focused on his work over the past 2 years. Every year, at the shareholders' meeting, my father insists I return to the country to represent him. I know what my parents are thinking, it amuses me, but I don't bother to expose it. After the meeting, Calvin would pull me into his car, saying it was on the way to visit my parents for the new year. Oscar loves Calvin. Someone secretly told him that Calvin is his father. So when he sees Calvin, he wriggles his little body and calls out for his dad to pick him up. Calvin adores him and never refuses. Now that the child's features are becoming more distinct, how could Calvin not understand? During the new year, I stay in the country to reunite with my family. Calvin cancels all his work to stay with us. He wants to ask if we should remarry. I refuse. Marriage should be either perfect or not at all. Otherwise, you're just inviting misery upon yourself. But Oscar, whenever he sees Calvin, is visibly happier than usual. He insists on sitting between Calvin and me, calling out Mom on one side and Dad on the other, laughing foolishly all the while. I tap the back of his head. telling him not to call out randomly. Calvin's eyes redden, and he seems at a loss. He has 1,000 apologies he wants to say to me, but I no longer need them.